Good afternoon, everybody. Thank you so much for coming today to our Lunch and a Bite presentation by Eric Warmka. I'm going to start off by just talking about a couple things that are upcoming here. So on Monday, we are starting the ambitious program of an 11-week summer camp. It's going to run Monday through Fridays from 7:30 in the morning till 5:30 p.m. Each week has a theme, so if you know anybody who has finished kindergarten through finished 5th grade, they are welcome to attend and join us. The Popcorn Wagon also opened last weekend on Saturday, and we're making 10 appearances this season, probably out by the gas pumps as our exterior is currently getting some revamp. Also, the Kiesling House opens on Friday, tomorrow. The Kiesling House opens tomorrow for the season, and that is going to be open on Fridays and Saturdays from noon to 4. So come join us there. We'll be having some programming over there as well. So stay tuned, and I will soon have you a list of who's appearing when. Also, we are in the midst of our efforts of lining up the 160th commemoration of the U.S. Dakota War. So please stay tuned. I will have those calendars out on our website very soon, and they'll be posted around the museum. So please join us for that. If you have any questions in the meantime on that, please feel free to call me. We do have a sign up for our July Lunch and a Bite speaker with George Downs talking about the grand old man of New Ulm, William Fender. So please, if you're interested, do that. And again, thank you guys. We'll get on with the show. Eric Warmka, thank you for joining us today.
Well, thank you very much, Amy, and thank you guys all for being here. As I started to put this program together, I was going, who's interested in funeral history that much, or is going to take time out of their lunch hour to come listen to this? But clearly there's some interest here on this. So thank you all for being here, and thanks for coming just to listen to what I have to say. So I'll just start with a little introduction about myself. My name is Eric Warmka. I currently serve as the general manager and a licensed funeral director for Minnesota Valley Funeral Homes. And as I promised direction here, I wasn't going to make this a pitch for Minnesota Valley Funeral Homes. I'm making this a history of where we started, where we are today. So with that said, I'm just going to kind of get into the presentation. So here's kind of a simplified image of where we are today. Now, being a funeral director is something that I've always been proud of. I've always been proud of this job that I did, this call it a calling that got me into this industry. But after doing a little research on the founding fathers, the forefathers of the industry here in Brown County, I have a new level of respect for what the men, they were men at that time, went through to get us to where we are to this day. So right now we're somewhat of a simplified operation. We have funeral chapels. Here in New Ulm, like I was telling Mr. Savoy in the back there, Minnesota Valley basically takes care of the east side of Brown County, and Sturm Funeral Home basically takes care of the west side. Names have changed over the years. There's been a lot of different funeral directors, different funeral homes throughout the centuries, but to this day, it's now Minnesota Valley and Sturm that cover the entire county. Right now, Sturm has 7 full-time funeral directors, and Minnesota Valley has 6. So when I say Brown County, we also take care of Nicollet and Sibley and Blue Earth County. So we do have quite a bit of a call area that 6 people take care of, men and women to this day. So with that, where did funerals start? We see where we are today, but where did it come from? Where did our customs, where did the traditions all originate? Funeral rites are as old as human culture itself. Funerary customs predate modern Homo sapiens. There's been archaeologists that have found Neanderthal skeletons that had characteristics of pollen covering the entire body, showing even in those times, in caveman times, there was some form of respect, some form of dignity, and some form of love of showing that they lost someone even in those times, which is very interesting to see that these skeletons, that they're covered with flowers, that was something that happened. Now, obviously, things happened between Homo sapiens and the Egyptians, but the Egyptians were the first to very well document and kind of became the originators of the funeral industry, for a lack of a better word. Funerary practices were believed necessary to ensure immortality in death. Rituals include mummification, magic spells, and a rite of burial with all of their specific grave goods to go with them in the afterlife. Today, I mean, you hear the figure of speech, you can't take it when you leave, you can't take it all with you when you leave. They believe the exact opposite. You needed to take all of your things with you when you left. You filled your shrine with all of your worldly possessions. And the other thing was, they were the first to actually have importance on purifying the body, saving the body, that they felt that you needed your physical body in the afterlife to continue to serve your pharaoh. And that's why you had to bring all of your things with you too. Founding people in Egyptian culture, you would embalm in some sense of the word. They had a different idea of what embalming was by all very strange stretch of the imagination, that the stomach, the intestines, the liver were all taken out and placed in separate canopic jars. The heart was always left because the heart was where they felt the soul was. The person's soul was in their heart. So that was what remained. Small caveat, I'm kind of a funeral history nerd myself. While I was going to college for this, I actually named my dog after that guy. That's Osiris. He's the god of the living and the dead. He's who decided where you were going to go if you were good enough to make it into the afterlife. So like I said, I've kind of had this in my background for quite a while. But yes, the Egyptians believed that ridding the body of all moisture, covering them with that salt, turning them into a mummy, that's what got you into the afterlife. So a very different belief system than what we have today, but that's kind of where it started. The 5 anchors of funeral, and these have been for the generations, a millennia, of there's always been symbolism. There's always been a sense of gathered community, some form of a ritual, you bring cultural heritage into that ritual, but all in all, the care of the deceased was what the main focus was. Now we'd start with symbolism. Now symbolism has changed versus religions and cultures, things like that. Right here we have a great example of modern symbolism. This is what we would kind of consider a full Catholic setup as a funeral home. There's symbolism of the crucifix. There's symbolism of the Christ candle. Candles were always very important. Kneelers that would have holy water to be placed on the deceased person or bless yourself with. There's always been some form of symbolism. There's other symbols that have come and gone for the most part. Over on the artifacts table there's a black badge that was to be worn. In 200 years ago, you were to dress all in black for an entire year as a widow or widower to show people that you were grieving, that you lost somebody. That badge right there was for a widow or a mother to wear. Right, that particular one that the Brown County Historical Society has was to state that that was a veteran, that mother or wife lost a veteran, indicated by the gold star that's on that. But that was something that they would wear to show people you were grieving. Symbolism. Gathered community. Here's just a simple image of the cathedral here in New Ulm, filled with people. What happened during COVID? We got rid of that one. We didn't get to have that one. We took that piece away. It was forced upon us. No one got to be together as a community, and it showed. It was hard. It was hard to be a funeral director. It was hard to be a minister, to minister to people that just lost someone so important, and to not have that support system behind you. It's an essential cog in those 5 anchors, to have a sense of community, someone to also see they meant the world to 200 other people that also are there to support you. When we took that away, it showed, and I felt for those families, and they came up and we found different ways of turning to your family a little bit more, but a gathered community is always an essential part of a funeral. Same with rituals and bringing in our heritage. They have changed. I mean, through the generations, I'm going to go into Christianity next year, but even the introduction of music or allowing cremations. Rituals have changed. Same with cultural heritage. Now, clearly we're a very Germanic community. Europeans have settled this area. Our cultures, our beliefs have all come from Europe, and that's where a lot of our roots and traditions still to this day come from. But like I said, all in all, there has always been an essential idea of care and love and dignity and respect for the deceased. Which, like I said, turns into the Christianity portion. I'm not going out on too far of a limb to say that Brown County, surrounding communities have predominantly been Christian or Protestant. Now, a lot of those beliefs have been told by leaders of Catholic churches, Lutheran churches, Methodist, Protestant churches, of what is allowed and accepted in a funeral. Funeral services have always conducted of some form of prayer, scripture, and in the past, a eulogy was always kind of a part or an essential piece of a funeral. It's a little less today. I don't know if it's a shyer generation we are, or just people that don't want to get up and speak in front of a crowd, but eulogies were an essential part of a funeral service. On the side note of Christianity, and just doing some research with Darla, there was one very, very interesting thing that ties to Brown County of funerals actually happened at Turner Hall. They have a full typed manuscript of a funeral service hosted at Turner Hall. Now, Turners aren't pagans, Turners are not non-Christian believers, but Turners had a stronger belief in poetry and education in that sense. So this typed manuscript was a beautiful service. No mention of God, no mention of resurrection. It's we're going to an afterlife. There's a better place, but it was tied to poetry, which was very interesting, and it's a wonderful thing that I didn't know existed, but Darla found for me, and it was beautiful to read a funeral, but a little different belief system to it. But with Christianity, like I said, most of our local ties still to this day are tied to the Christian belief. Historically, burial was what was taught as a common accepted disposition of a person. You were to be buried. In our pioneer days, we didn't have the established cemetery systems and bookkeeping that we have now, but burials would typically take place on the farm, under a favorite tree, something that was meaningful to that family. As time went on, there were reinterments and placement into like the pioneer section of the cemetery, but while our pioneer forefathers were establishing Brown County, it was common to just bury on the farm. Music was only accepted into the 21st century as to be a part of a funeral service. That was somewhat interesting to me. And cremation, which right now half of the services we conduct in Brown County are cremations. But that was only 30 plus years ago that was even accepted as a means of disposition by a lot of the churches in our area. But to this day, this type of ceremony, this type of service is what we all have come to know and expect. Part of funeral now is embalming. Now, to this day, embalming is to open and I have to give this caveat, to have a public service where the body is shown to the public, embalming has to happen. Those rules didn't always exist. Laws have changed and Department of Health has gotten involved, so it is now a state and national law that if the public is invited to a service, embalming has to happen. Where did embalming come from? Now, the primary reason we embalm to this day is to disinfect, prevent the spread of disease, and just to simply slow the decomposition of a body. European scientists in the 18th century started to show interest in human anatomy, why we're getting sick, why the plague took so many, why things like that were happening. These scientists needed to find a way to study these bodies, to study human anatomy, to start to study the origins of disease, that they needed a way to keep bodies preserved. So they started to come up with this in the 18th century of ways to, they weren't arterially embalming, they were placing chemicals on the bodies to embalm them, but it started in the 18th century for medical science purposes. The French were the ones that decided it was a fashionable way to honor the deceased. I thought that was an interesting thing, that it's a fashionable thing to honor them. I was like, well, come to the French. William Hunter was the first to actually apply the methods of arterial embalming in this mid-18th century. Arterial embalming is what we do to this day. But where it came from was it gained notoriety, it gained acceptance at the Civil War. that one of Lincoln's closest friends was a Union soldier named Colonel Ellsworth. He was technically the first casualty of the Civil War. Lincoln was devastated when he lost his friend. He was in Virginia, Lincoln was in New York State. Thomas Holmes, an American scientist who studied as a coroner's physician in New York, also studied the French embalming practices, told Lincoln he would volunteer to embalm his friend Colonel Ellsworth. He brought him then to New York City, where he laid in state at the executive mansion for 10 days and allowed thousands of Union soldiers to come pay their respects. The Union soldiers and the president were impressed. They had never seen something like this before, that this person looked natural. They looked peaceful. They were there for 2 weeks and still nothing had changed. So all of a sudden, the Army got involved. Lincoln was involved. Dr. Holmes received a commission from the president, President Lincoln, to become the Army Medical Corps' chief embalmer. He was a soldier. Here's an image of actual Mr. Holmes. It's known he embalmed over 4,000 bodies himself during the time of the Civil War. The original embalming fluid that they came up with was a mix of arsenic, mercury, zinc, alcohol, creosote, and turpentine. Good stuff. I'm like, 4 of those are complete carcinogens, and yeah, so I respect what these men went through on the battlefields, that once a battle was done, complete, they would go out and prep bodies to be shipped back to the Union. They were the first and the only to do that. And it was kind of incredible. That showed that all of a sudden people were able to bring their loved ones home for the first time in history. The one somewhat macabre thing that would go on, though, was before you went to battle, you pre-funded your funeral service. Not good for morale, that you had to have a tag in your Union coat that said, yep, he's good to go home. He's prepaid. And Lincoln abolished that. He said, no more of that. That's hurting no one wants to go to battle if they have to sign for get their train ticket home in that way. So, but that was something that actually did happen in the funeral industry. The railroad system also made it possible to bring bodies home, but it would still take over 2 weeks. But this started to be seen, that even 2 weeks later, a person could still look themselves and the family could then have some form of an honorable goodbye to them. Just looking to see here. Also, the other one that really brought national coverage because it was very publicized was in Lincoln's death. Lincoln had a funeral train. You guys know, have ever heard of that? It was a train that went from Baltimore to Philadelphia to New York City, Cleveland, Indianapolis, and Chicago before he was finally laid to rest in Springfield. But this funeral train procession were people for the first time ever, some, like I said, if they didn't have a soldier that was embalmed, they got to see Lincoln. That didn't happen. That hadn't happened in the past, but for 2 weeks, they were still able to see President Lincoln and pay their respects. That's where all of a sudden embalming started to be a thing that was desired, was asked for. Which brings us to Brown County. Now these are all images that have been procured here at the Historical Society, but right here is an image of, at the time, funeral homes. Funeral homes as we know them to this day didn't exist. You had your funeral at your home, typically in the parlor. Some of these names that still to this day stick around, you'd have your funeral in the parlor. You'd sit with the body, sometimes for days on end, to see if they came awake. Now the reason why we call it awake to this day, right here, right? Right here is a display. This is all procured from Chicago. This is from a previous employer of mine in St. Cloud. He was a funeral historian to a T. He loved funeral history. He had me go get this stuff from Chicago. He was a great funeral historian, but he never looked at this stuff. So when I told him I was doing this presentation, I said, "Do you still have that stuff?" And he goes, "Yeah, it's right where you left it, up in the attic." So I drove up to St. Cloud and I brought it home. It is immaculate. It is in perfect shape for things that are over 100 years old. These curtains, these drapes, some of these kneelers, they're stamped from 1919. I mean, that's incredible that this exists. But this is what a funeral director would bring to the home to display the person on. Similar to exactly what you see here, this is Lieutenant Louie Miller in 1898. Obviously a soldier might have died in battle. I don't know that answer, but this is what a typical setting, and I've heard from just around the room of people remembering. I went to my grandpa's funeral. I went to a friend's funeral, and it was held in the home. Probably something very similar to this, that a funeral director in those days would bring a cooling table to the home. If embalming was needed or asked for, embalming would take place in the home. Over here, some might not want to see it, but they are jars that embalming fluid would go in, blood would come out. The funeral director would do this, either place the body in a casket or on a table like this, and go about their day. They would then come back maybe 2 days later to actually help bury the body. But this is what a common thing that would happen in the early pioneer days and sometime into the 1900s. This is a common setting. Other things that were very important to families in this generation were imagery, photography. Photography was becoming a very accepted thing and a very known thing. If you didn't have a family photo, like this particular family would have had, you'd either sue. We don't have Photoshop back in the 1900s, but we'd bring his image in. So he would still be memorialized in a family setting. Things were a child. This right here is Miss Leopold Setsky and her baby Clara. Baby Clara died in the aftermath of the Dakota War. She was 3 years old. So that's another image that's held here in Brown County. A little bit different here is another gentleman named Ted Lemke. Nope, not Ted Lemke. That's Frank Rebner. His eyes were open. He was deceased in this picture, but he is shown looking as though he was alive so that family could keep that image of their deceased loved one. This is Miss Shell, Miss Teresa Shell, at the Shell Mansion. This is August's wife in a setting very similar to what you see here, covered in blankets, pillows, but comfortable. She was displayed at the mansion and laid like that. This was donated by the Shell Marty family for retention purposes here at the museum as well. I think this image is absolutely awesome. It's very blurry, and I'm sorry for that, but you can see New Ulm in the background and a funeral procession of horse and buggy going out to Klossner. This is the service of Ted Lemke, but just an absolute amazing picture, which I don't even know how it really exists, but how beautiful a funeral procession would have been to go out to Klossner. To this day, we still do that. Still have to process to Klossner. This is from Sleepy Eye. We believe the Hoyt Funeral Home, Sleepy Eye, Springfield, but showing the image of the horse-drawn hearse. That again, the funeral may have been conducted in a home, but then the funeral director or undertaker at that time, I hate that term, but it's part of our history, undertaker would then bring them to their final place of rest. Here is the imagery from that first gentleman, the soldier that was laid out at his home, at his graveside, surrounded by other soldiers. And all of the flowers. Flowers were very important back in those days too, shown in these images, which again, these are all here at the museum, of just beautifully elaborate flower displays that to this day, that's still a part of our traditions. You send flowers. It shows respect. It shows you love. But that has been around for all of this time. They're, again, hard to read, but these are the black images. These are prayer cards. I think that one is 1916. The other image here, yes, died in 1916. We still made prayer cards back then. We still do this. This is still a part of a funeral, that it's a remembrance card. It's something just to remember that person by. Might have a prayer, might have their obituary, might tell a little something about themselves, but this has been around and a part of our customs and culture for all of our time here in Brown County. Which brings us to, where did the funeral homes come from? What did they start with? Does anyone know where funeral homes, what founded a funeral home, or what?
Furniture stores.
Furniture stores, exactly. You could make a box, you can make a coffin. If you didn't know how to make a box, you had to go buy one. So here in New Ulm, one of the founders of the first people that offered this as a service was Charles Wagner. Where did I miss my place here? A death would occur, you'd load up your wagon, you'd go to town, you'd purchase a coffin and bury your loved one on the property or on some form of dignified land. There's still some township cemeteries that farmers in an area would all gather together, and that's where you'd lay to rest. But that's what you would do. You would go to town, you'd buy your coffin and bring it back home. Now, Charles Wagner was the first to advertise coffins from his furniture store. Charles Wagner Furniture was located at 120 North Minnesota Street. Yep, Elner's. Did someone just say that? Oops, did I skip a page? Nope, I didn't. I just need to keep going here. Ernest Bobson was another gentleman in New Ulm that he started the Midwest Casket Company, which gave more options to the county. Wagner later sold his business to a gentleman with the last name of Saverin, who later turned to Forster's, which we'll get to. As time went on and communities and families and households grew, there became a need for funeral parlors. Death rate was very high in these days. A woman maybe had 8 kids, one of them most likely would pass on an average. So we started to have a need for some form of funeral options. Now, Louie Binger was born in Germany in 1839. He came here in 1863, later started a furniture and funeral business. He made all of his coffins himself. His furniture store was one of the first to actually contain some form of a funeral parlor, a display casket room, and a fully equipped morgue and a small chapel. Can't imagine how that all fit in there. I believe that it was noted in Elroy's book here that was down by the Christmas house, or what we call that area of town right now. So he, like I said, was the first to actually have something in his furniture store that also accommodated funerals. 1912, Louis turned his business over to his brothers, Emil and Otto. Otto built a new building and expanded onto North Minnesota, and then purchased the residence and converted it into a funeral home. Here's where we get to kind of the roots of funeral homes as we know them today, is the Forsters, John Forster. He partnered with his brother and opened a furniture and undertaking business. So again, he wasn't a funeral director, to be said, but he was an undertaker. He knew how to, which back in those days, if you know how to and have the want to do this, it was a career. He purchased that Saverin building at North Minnesota. Now Elner's sign is on that. John Forster and his 2 sons, Hugo and Harold, also went into the business with one son, Elmer Poli. All 3 of them got a license. The 40s were the first time that we actually had a license to do this job. Chicago was one of the first to actually have a funeral or a mortuary college to give some form of formal training instead of just passing it down generationally, that you could go to Worsham College and get an actual degree to be an embalmer. So they were some of the first to actually do that. So like I said, Forster Furniture, behind it was call it a mansion, call it a home, but that was also where the Forster Funeral Home was held, funeral parlor. Right over here, to my left, is Elmer Poli's actual funeral tuxedo. My wife, Sarah, went to a chamber convention and was sitting down with the chamber director in Northfield, which is Elmer Poli's great-granddaughter. Said she inherited his funeral suit, which is absolutely amazing. Us funeral directors all looked at it and went, thank God we got rid of funeral tuxedos that were made out of solid wool. But things that I thought were interesting were it is embroidered with John H. Forster Funeral Home on the inside of his lapel, and it's also embroidered with Mr. Poli's name on the inside of his suit. Just let you look at that for a second and see if you see anything unique. With lady assistant. Isn't that something? So the Gerber Getstad Funeral Home came to, yep, that was a big deal. Now the lady assistant, she was, what was it, Ida Mae? Did I have it on here? Yep, Ida Mae Getstad. She was a hairdresser. She also ran a beauty salon. but would help at the funeral home. So that was what we call progressive for its time, I guess. But like it says here, 1927, a new undertaking business would start. Up-to-date funeral home is what they offered. They were at 109 to 111 North Broadway, so kind of kitty corner to where the Minnesota Valley Funeral Home stands today, or New Ulm Tire, kind of in that stretch. Owners were John Gerber of New Ulm and Oscar Gedstead of Chicago. Now, Oscar came with his embalming license. Gerber worked for Mr. Forster. Gedstead learned his undertaking business in Chicago. And like I said, lady assistant just kind of made me chuckle when I saw that as an ad. To this day, right now, 80% of the graduating class are ladies of funeral directors. That this, historically, has been a male-dominated position. To now, going forward, it is very much so going to be a female-dominated occupation, which is amazing. It's just very unique that over time, it has changed so rapidly to the other way that not that many years ago, that was a big deal. And now it's going to be predominantly women in the industry, which is amazing. Which gets us into kind of where we are to now. Let me get my part here again. So, Minnesota Valley Burial Association came into existence in 29. It was located in the same building or same stretch of buildings as Gerber Gedstead Funeral Home. Opie Gedstead was hired as their first undertaker and embalmer. So he would moonlight for both, which is kind of frowned upon in the industry today. You don't really go work for the neighbor, the literal neighbor, and work as a funeral director, but that is what happened. Later, John Gerber joined Minnesota Valley as well, which dissolved the Gerber Gedstead Funeral Home. 38, Minnesota Valley Funeral Home purchased the home of Dr. J. Vogel, and that's where they are to this day. So the first funeral home, or first Minnesota Valley Funeral Home, is on the corner, kind of where the bank sits to now, in the same parking lot of the funeral home, or technically kind of the parking lot of the funeral home, and then later was renovated into the building you see today. Just seeing if there's any other caveats to this one right here. So Gedstead, James Hines. Oh, I'm sorry. Later, Gedstead left Minnesota Valley and joined a gentleman named James Hines, starting the Gedstead Hines Funeral Home on the south side of town. Later on, that turned to Furley. Furley built what we now know as the South Chapel, which then turned to the Schmucker Funeral Home, which now turned to Minnesota Valley. So there was always one that took care of the north side and one that took care of the south side. And from what I'm told, one took care of the Catholics and the other took care of the Protestants. And now we're all one big happy family and we take care of anybody. But just kind of interesting how one guy worked for this one and then he later left and went to work, started his own little shop and started his own, well, wonderful funeral home. Beautiful, beautiful home that still is around, but South Chapel is now in existence. So we got through where the Minnesota Valley started, but why did it start? So Minnesota Valley is, to this day, the only cooperative funeral home that exists. There's two of them. I have to say that there's two cooperative funeral homes in the entire nation that do what Minnesota Valley Funeral Home still does to this day, of actually giving back dividends. It's a nonprofit cooperative funeral home. If we make a profit, it goes back to the families that were served that year. So even in its start in 1929, it formed from area people being alarmed at the high cost of dying, wanted to form this cooperative to form reasonable funeral costs. Now, I still consider Minnesota Valley reasonable, but these books that have always been in the basement of the North Chapel go back to the 40s. There's some that go back earlier. But these are full documents of everyone's funeral that Minnesota Valley ever handled. Every bit of detail about their family, where they're laid to rest, information about the service, and how much their funeral cost. So being alarmed at the high cost of dying, this one in, what year do we got? 48, $290 was the funeral. 870, that must have been a good one. But I just donated these books, which I said are all very well cataloged, very well kept. to the Historical Society for genealogy purposes, that if someone really wants to know who their family is, where they lay to rest, these books are a gold mine of information for people to actually look up their histories and to know about every bit that might not exist, because the internet didn't exist then. Everything is now digital. Everything is now saved either paper copies or digital copies. But in these days, this was how things were kept. So like I said, the Burial Association came to be, like I said, they were alarmed at how high priced funerals were, so the cooperative started. The original first board members, and it still operates like this to this day, that it represents the entire county, or our shade of the county. So there was a Spellbrink, and William Fender took care, and Herman Uni took care of Milford Township, or represented Milford Township. A Merkel and a Testro were home. Whitty and Fred Schultz were Sigel Township representatives. Gustav Schrader was Kloster, and Raleigh Albrecht was Fairfax. That's still how we operate, and I absolutely love that. That I get input from the entire county of different people that tell me how they think we should operate. It's, like I said, that doesn't exist. In the 60s, funeral homes, for-profit funeral homes kind of squashed out cooperative funeral homes. We stayed strong, hung together, had great representation, great management. They kept us through it. And what we have in New Ulm is a treasure. It doesn't, like I said, a funeral home that doesn't intend to make a profit, that doesn't exist anywhere. Not in the state, one in Washington State. But the fact that we have that here in New Ulm is absolutely amazing. Obviously, I can't, like I said, this isn't a sales pitch for Minnesota Valley, but it is interesting that is, like we said, started with so many different options, so many different origins, like I said, furniture store to a furniture store / undertaker, to embalmers, bringing in licensed embalmers, to now what it is today, a cooperative funeral home. But obviously we also have the Sturm Funeral Home that takes care of, like I said, the west side of Brown County. Sleepy Eye, Springfield, Comfrey, they all have buildings in. But over the course of time, they all combined in the same way to eventually become the Sturm Funeral Home that it is today. That those are the only places that they have actual chapels. With the need, I mean, sometimes we don't need a full formal funeral home in like the city of Hanska, but we still serve the people of Hanska. Customs change, traditions change. Sometimes now people like to have their full funerals at a church. Some people want to have their funerals at their home still. But like I said, that's why things have become more simplified. That we all have wonderful funeral chapels that are state of art, modern, up to date, but we do take care of the entire county amongst 13 funeral directors, which is kind of remarkable. So what's next? Where are things going to change? Heaven knows I don't want to go back to that, or this, or that. But things are going to change. We all know that. Cremation is on the rise. It's a more simplified, call it an easier way of a disposition. My generation might be default for that. Death is hard. Death has always been hard. You lose a child, you lose a loved one. Back in those days, it was the women in the household took care of getting the deceased ready. Then we brought in professionals. Now it is to the way it is today. But things are changing a little bit. I've had a need for an ask for actual at-home funerals again. I hosted an at-home funeral on someone's farm this last year. Absolutely amazing. One of the most meaningful services I've ever been a part of. But things are going to change. Like I said, we have cremation is common, and I'm not saying it's popular, but it's something that generationally it becomes easier. I want to remember that person the way they were. I don't want to go through the pain, the having to say my last goodbyes. And again, that's my generation saying that's hard. I don't want to go through hard. I want to make this easy. It is easier. But there is a psychological thing that has been around since the Egyptians of you need to say goodbye to a person. There's a reason we do this. There's a reason we have funerals to bring in the public, to be able to say goodbye to that person. I tell people this in a lot of lecture series, that person might have been your mom or dad, but they meant the world to 200 other people. to cut them out, to not give them the opportunity to ever come and say a last goodbye, is psychologically tough on people. It hurts. As long as you have some form of a ceremony, as long as you have some form of honor, some form of respect for a life lived, that's what's important. It doesn't matter if we go back to doing this at a home, doing it at someone's farm, hosting a funeral at a funeral home, hosting it at a park or at Turner Hall. As long as you give an opportunity for people to come say their goodbyes, that's what's important. Staying connected to our history is also important. Teaching this stuff, where did it come from? I mean, I'm a funeral nerd. I mean, this is what I do for a profession, and I've always wanted to know why, and I loved getting to dig into Brown County and see where we all came from. But it's something that we need to teach the next generation why this is important, why you should go through these things. Take your kids on a cemetery tour. We moved here in August, just under 9 years ago. I think the first week, Sarah came to me and said, there's a cemetery tour coming up. I said, I'm going to work at a funeral home. Why on earth would I go to a cemetery tour? That's where I'm going to spend all of my time. Has anyone been on a cemetery tour of Brown County? Quite a few hands go up. It was one of the most amazing things I've ever sat through. The things I learned, the fact that the Pioneer section exists and is so wonderfully maintained and teaches where our founding fathers came from, who are the people that started this town, and how important they were. And I mean, that was what I learned. And it was like the first week I was here, I was just bombarded with this, and it was amazing. And I still love driving through that section, seeing what the pioneers' traditions, their customs, those beautiful elaborate tree headstones. You don't see that anywhere. I mean, you do. Every now and then in Stearns County, you'll pop into a cemetery, and that's where I came from before this, you'll see one, but it isn't anything like what we have here. And it's remarkable. So do things like that. Tell your families what things are important to you, what symbols, what things do you want to be remembered for, but also teach them why we do these things. Anyways, that concludes my full presentation. Obviously, this fine book, which I hear is hard to come by, but I got a lot of the information from Elroy Ubel's book. It is a remarkable resource of where our founding fathers came from, where funeral industry came from, is all in here. So if you can find a friend that has a copy of this or find one for yourselves, it's unbelievable. So pass that on, keep teaching, but I appreciate you all for coming. There's no way I could touch everything that was in this book, but I hope you got a little something out of this. So does anyone have questions? And please have questions. Yes, Pastor Sharp?
How many funerals do you do a year?
Great question. How many funerals do we do a year? Last year we did 312. It was the most we've ever handled in Brown County, in New Ulm, at Minnesota Valley in history. I saw in some past references in newspaper clippings that previous generations ago managers that 150 was the most we've ever had to handle. And then it was 200. Once we hit that plateau, that's the most. Now we're over 300. So when we're doing almost a funeral nearly every day, it's a taxing profession. But again, it's one that I wake up and come to work every day proud to do and proud to serve. Yes? Last year it was 55%. So over half were cremations.
How many of those families are taking the ashes home with them versus putting them in a crematorium?
In a columbarium or having a committal, I would say probably 10% of those, maybe even less than that. Like she just asked, how many people just take their urn home with them? And to some people, it is important that I don't want them interred in a cemetery. They'd rather be scattered on their cornfield. My dad has told me that for years, that I want to have a full funeral, but I want to be buried. I want my ashes scattered on my field. It was my dad's land and it's mine. If that's what's important to a person, absolutely. You have every right in the world to do that with ashes. You as a landowner, person, you can scatter your own ashes on your own land, or if you have permission to do so. But it's not very common. Most people still have some form of burial. That, just going religious-wise, the Catholic Church still believes, and most Catholics believe, you are to be buried in sacred ground. That you're to have that as part of your full funeral rite, that your body is interred in sacred ground. And even if it's above ground or in the ground, that's a belief. And that's why a lot of our cemeteries are putting up columbariums, the above ground niches that the urn is placed in. It's a little more cost effective, and it saves land. You're not having to purchase land. You're placing your ashes in a niche, but it's something that you know where your loved one is for 100 years down the road, that's where they're still going to be. So that's, for the most part, and again, that's our traditions, our customs that have been passed on from grandparents and great-grandparents, is you were to be laid to rest in a cemetery. But there are some that change from that. Yes, sir? Yeah. No. Once the urn is placed in the niche, it's sealed in there and it's locked. So there isn't a way to come and actually open the niche, but it's in there sealed, which a lot of times people will tuck, like the Egyptians would, some of their very important things in their life in their niche with them. It just gives a little bit of extra comfort and peace to that family, knowing some of their favorite things are always going to be there by their side. Yep. Yes, ma'am.
Where did the term undertaker come
From the literal sense of the word, of you are undertaking a very difficult thing, but you're also taking them to their final place of rest. You're undertaking the burdens, the grief, the stress, and you are burying. So, undertaker was the first coined term for a modern funeral director. It was undertaker, it was mortician, it was embalmer, mortician, and now to this day the commonly known as funeral director. But it started as undertaker. Wasn't the professional wrestler. Yes, Pastor Shar.
What's the attrition rate for funeral directors? Kind of the burnout rate for funeral directors?
Yes, great question. The U of M is the only program in Minnesota that still offers a mortuary science class or a mortuary science degree. In the Midwest, it is a 4-year college degree. It's not a diploma. They do say it's a third of the graduating class will burn out before 10 years. So if a graduating class sends 20 students out, which is a good year, a third of them aren't going to be in the industry in 10 years. So it is definitely an industry that, if anyone has any kids, grandkids that are interested in, it's one that you can throw a dart at the map of America and find 10 funeral homes desperate for help. But, yes, sir.
In 1982, I went out to Oregon
Mm-hmm.
for my brother-in-law's funeral, and traditions are different.
They are.
Every area.
Yep.
It was very, because I had been working part-time with
Yep.
funeral homes here in town.
Yep.
And I got talking to the undertaker out there, and I said, how long is they didn't have a date for the funeral.
Yeah. It's a little more up in the air.
How long will they keep my brother-in-law? He said, as long as people keep coming.
Yep. There's certain areas of the country.
Coming,
Yep.
we set a date.
Yeah, here in the Midwest, generally you have a visitation or a wake, maybe the day before a funeral service. Maybe it's 3 hours, maybe it's 4 hours, 5 if you're really pushing it. But there's certain areas of the country still to this day that maybe have visitations that go on for days. That's some of that old generation that you stayed with the body for days to see if they would come awake. And those are things that just get passed down generationally. The other one, Midwest-wise, if you ever see a person in a casket, you never see their legs. East Coast you do. New York, Philadelphia, it's called a full couch casket, that the whole casket opens up. It's a modesty panel here in the Midwest. We're a modest culture. We like to have a lap blanket on our knees. We don't want to show leg. But that's, again, a cultural or traditions being changed, that to this day, it's still full caskets open up. You see their shoes. Different here. Modest cultures. Yes, Denny.
Highly recommend anybody making a trip south visit New Orleans. Part of New Orleans is below sea level,
Nope.
and so the bodies cannot be put on the ground, so they're buried above ground. And about every 2 years, they can be with a rake, the bones pushed back because they are by solar energy burned.
Yep.
Disappear.
We toured a beautiful cemetery in the middle of New Orleans about a decade ago, Sarah and I, and exactly what he's saying. I actually talked to a cemetery manager, and he said to buy a new plot today is over $100,000. That they have no land, they have no places for this. They said our cremation rate is about 95%. No one can afford to actually be buried in some sense of the word in that area, the bayou, those states. It's just, you can't afford it. That if you have a plot in the family, many times that plot is used time and time and time again. That it's almost a scroll on a tab on the face of this that just shows name, 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 name. And it's like, well, how can 10 people be in this one? They are, but it's exactly how it is. Yes, in the back, Kathleen.
Eric, you mentioned that at one point in time people might bury a loved one on the farm.
Yep.
What happens now with farmers, and I used to be a farmer, always wanting to show more land, and if they encroach on that burial site, what is the process to have that?
Once ownership of the land transfers, it's that new owner's right to do with whatever they want to with that land. If it was not designated as a cemetery space, they can till right on over it.
Have you come across any cases where somebody didn't know that there was burial on their site and harmed them?
That I don't know. I personally haven't. I don't know. We have another dignitary in the audience here. I don't think that's happened in the past either.
It's illegal to bury on the land.
It's now illegal to bury on the land. Yep.
There's a rigmarole you gotta go through that nobody wants to go through to get that designated as a burial plot. Although out in Portland, when I was funeral director, we went through that once.
Yep. Yeah, it's like he said, it's now, you cannot just go bury your loved one on your land. You can scatter their ashes or bury their urn on the land, but again, as if you transfer the title to someone else, they can dig that up and it's theirs. But in those pioneer days, it was typically in a pine box. There really isn't going to be much left of that to be known, to be able to move. But
Annie Mary 20s, I'm sure you're familiar with that. Her grave was all surrounded by fence and brick walls, and her grave was moved from here to another cemetery in northern Minnesota, and now that is all tilled up into farmland.
right. Yes, Darla.
I had someone call me one time, somewhere in Brown County. They wanted to build a house on farmland.
Mm-hmm.
And they had heard that there was a burial on their property and wondered what they could do. And so we worked with one of the funeral directors here, and
Mm-hmm.
it happened to be a farm that at one time was owned by some of my mother's cousins, so they knew where the burial was.
Wow.
And then they asked what the procedure would be to remove that burial, and again, when they found out what they all had to go through to remove a possible
Mm-hmm. Grave space.
remain,
Yep.
they chose to build their house someplace else.
See, again,
They
that's,
didn't want 'em, have to
don't want to
go through all
disturb.
that.
Right. There's a respect to that.
Yes, I have a question. When you are cremated,
Mhm.
all the remains fit in the column burial, in the urn, or whatever you choose?
Absolutely. In all of us is calcium and carbon, about the same amount. You can look around this room, we're not any, some of us are bigger, some of us are smaller, but we all have calcium and carbon is what our basis of us is. Cremation does what time will do to all of us. It turns us to our basic elements, calcium and carbon. It does it in 3 hours versus 100 years, but that's what remains, is basically the skeletal system. That's broken down to a fine powder, and they all fit in the same size urn. And then that all fits in the same size columbarium space.
And what size is that?
About the size of a Folgers coffee can. About that, yeah. It's because that's just it. There's certain people that want to make their own urn. That maybe they're a crafter, maybe they work with clay, work with wood. You can make your own urn. You can make your own casket. Father Rademacher, I'm keeping his beautiful casket that he made in the funeral home right now. But there's a lot of people have a piece to that you can be buried. I mean, you can make your own urn and tuck that into your own space, but they are all about the same size. I have a lot of woodworkers that come and say, how big does it need to be? And I give them exact specs, and it's all good. So.
What size is that?
Cannot be any higher than 11 1/4 inches and can't be any wider than 11. Yeah. So about that big. Yep, there you go. Find a beautiful vase. Yeah. Yes, ma'am.
What happens if you have like artificial shoulders?
Sure. Knees, hips, all those things. They stay. If you have a belt buckle on, that stays.
I mean, during cremation?
Cremation, it stays perfect. When a cremation is complete, it's there. That hip is perfect. It's titanium. It stays, and it's sent to a company that recycles that.
Okay.
Yeah. The other question that we get often is gold teeth. What do you do with those? They stay with the person. They don't get taken out. They don't the gold doesn't get removed. The gold in teeth fillings is so not valuable that it does not pay to have it removed by any means. It just stays with that person. But metal, once cremation happens, it's absolutely perfect and it's there. Yeah, that's a good question. Anything else? Yes, ma'am.
To your question.
Yeah.
Listen to a program on aquamation and green burial.
Yep.
That's something that's likely to.
Yep, she's talking about green cremation, or aquamation. That's just certain people they don't like the idea of flame or heat doing it, and it does have some form of environmental ideas to it too. Aquamation is using water and lye to do the exact same thing that cremation will do. There is a funeral home that Bruce and I went to in Windham, Minnesota, that they invested in a green crematory instead of one that uses heat. A little bit more costly, a little bit more time consuming, but it does exist. There's only a handful in the state, but if anyone ever asks, we are able to have that happen. They're friends, we're all friends in the funeral industry. They would gladly help us. Yes, ma'am. Green cemeteries, that's another good question. Don't technically exist yet. I can see my generation changing that. A green cemetery is you're to be buried and become one with the earth again. Ashes to ashes, dust to dust, the literal term of that. They don't technically exist. The Jewish faith believes that and has always believed that you are to be placed in a casket, that no burial vault, nothing that will ever protect that person from breaking down. Embalming doesn't happen. They're to be placed in that casket and buried within 48 hours in a casket that will break down. They're considered green and always have been before the term was coined, but there's technically 2 Jewish cemeteries in the Twin Cities area, and they don't typically let others in. But I can, again, see that changing. I had someone approach me from the Mankato area because no one there would help them, and I said, if you need help, I will be a funeral or a professional in the industry if this is something that you want to pursue, I will help you with. But, yes, ma'am.
Okay, now cemetery plots are normally sized to accommodate coffins.
Correct.
Now, if a person decides to do cremation, is that can only one be?
2. Yep, and that's the majority of this is a Brown County speech, the majority, and I'd say 98% of the cemeteries say one grave space can house a casket or 2 urns. So there's some that'll give a little wiggle room there, but. Any other questions?
I'm just going to ask if people want to see these items.
Hey, good sales pitch there. If anyone would like to see these items in the future, they will be on display in the Historical Society. There's an exhibitor's section on the second floor that these will be on display for maybe a month, maybe more, depending on when I take it down. But yes, these will be on display. If you guys ever want to see them, they'll be up on the second floor in the upcoming week here. So, yes, sir.
I'm 600 pounds. How are you going to bury me?
You better have 5 strong or 6 strong friends.
Do they make provisions for
They absolutely do, yes. In casket terms, I mean, I've gone to funeral directors' conventions that 4 people can fit side by side in a casket, that they make them wider, wider, wider. Lengthwise, if a person is 7 or 8 feet tall, you just bend the knee. Now, get rid of that one right away, that old caveat of what happens with that 8-footer? He fit in the same one that that 5-foot guy did. But, but no, they do go wider. Yep. And like I said, you better have 6 strong friends. There'll be one funeral director on the end breaking his back. Anything else? Yes?
I had a question going back in
Yeah.
the turn of the century. We were going through our grandparents' pictures, found a photo of 6 women pallbearers carrying a casket to its resting place in white. They were dressed in white.
Sure.
I always thought it'd be more men doing that.
Culturally speaking, it is men. Even to this day, I'll sit down with someone that maybe they're in their 90s, and someone will bring up a lady being a funeral or a pallbearer, and they don't like that idea. That's a man's job. But there is nothing wrong with lady pallbearers, women as pallbearers. Just tell them not to wear heels. That was different, especially wearing white as a casket bearer. Yeah, that's incredible. Huh? Yes, ma'am.
The Redeemer in Lutheran Church once had a sign that said, "Don't wait till 6 men have to carry you back to church."
Yep. No, get your plans put on paper right away. Nope, every funeral home in the county will gladly take anything, just what's important to you. And like I kind of made that as part of my presentation of, let people know what's important to you. There's a lot of times we come to a house and we go, did they want to be cremated or laid to rest in a casket? And they'll look at you blank and go, we've never talked about it. It's so easy to avoid that conversation because no one wants to talk, no one wants to look at this stuff, no one wants to talk about this. But it is important. It is something that you should have those, even if it's a minor conversation, or come talk to a funeral professional. We're all there to help you and to help you with that. So it's not 6 strong men having to carry you and do the work for you. Yes, sir.
I recently had to do some research on a cemetery, Burr Oak, Iowa.
Okay.
And that's where a lot of my family's buried. But in doing the research, all of a sudden you're looking at Burr Oak, Illinois Cemetery. And it was a sham. They were not really burying bodies where they said they were. They were reusing plots. Out in these backwoods were a lot of coffins. And
there's a lot of...
I just wanted to say one more thing about it.
Yeah.
The groundskeeper was making over $500,000 a year.
There's a lot of strange that still goes on in funeral industry to this day. I'm proud to be a part of the Midwest and always have been. Midwest has some of the strictest rules and oversight of what goes on at a funeral. I promote it. I love it. The fact that I could graduate from high school, go to a 3-month course in Colorado and become a funeral director? No, there's so much more to know about this industry than a 3-week or a 3-month course can teach you. But there are certain states like Colorado, Illinois, for Florida, or it's always Florida. But they just have no requirements. They have, and that's where the stuff like that, those weird stories start to pop up. You never hear it in Minnesota. You don't hear it in Wisconsin. Like I said, we can't do something even remotely sideways and we're looked at by the state. So, yeah. Yes, ma'am.
I just want to thank you for donating the burial books.
You're very welcome. Like I said, once I started really going through them, I just said, this is a resource for the county. This is something that more people need to see than just in the basement of the funeral home. So having that as an archive for families to be able to look back, you're welcome. You're very welcome. I'm glad to be able to do that. So keep them safe. But thank you guys very much. I appreciate this. Hope you learned a little something.
Well, thank you, Eric, for joining us today. So NewCat is here. They're recording. So there will be a link on our website available in the future if you would like to watch this again or tell other people who were not able to attend today. Also, as we pointed out, that this is going to be moving into the museum now to be our guest curator for, what, 2 months maybe?
Outstanding.
So tell your friends to come visit if they're interested in that. And then also our cemetery tour is going to be Sunday, August 21st. So if you haven't attended one of those, please join us for that. So again, thank you all for coming, and hopefully we'll see you next time.
And thank you to all of these people that helped me put this together. Darla, Elroy's book is such a resource. My old boss, Bill Carlin, and Jane Poli Bartho for her beautiful tuxedo here. So again, thank you to those people.